Yeah, sorry, I didn't get to. Well, we've got a fast-moving set of sessions here, and what we're doing now is we're moving directly onto our next panel, which is focusing on infrastructure, unclogging the arteries. We've got an amazing lineup of 3 CEOs in front of us that are going to be able to bring us lots of insights and knowledge from their very significant experience across a range of areas. In the order in which they'll present their opening addresses, we've got Nick Leggett, Chief Executive of Infrastructure New Zealand. We've got Alison Andrew. Sorry, we've moved the order around a bit, but we can go in this order. Alison Andrew is the Chief Executive Officer of Transpower. And we've got Chris Joblin, who is the CEO of Tainui Group Holdings. So let's turn straight to you, Nick, for your opening remarks.
Kia ora koutou katoa. A warning that some of the themes that I discuss follow on very nicely from the previous session. And there are 100 messages that I could deliver from those whose lives are concerned with the building of quality, sustainable and enduring public infrastructure. Those of us concerned with that outcome, about 5 million of us, will have many different desires and aspirations that we want to see. Reliable and safe connections from school to work to home, protection against extreme weather and earthquakes in communities, decent place to live, great educational space for children to learn in, quality and sustainable energy and digital connectivity. The list could be endless. And while we've still got a lot to celebrate in this country, there is this sinking feeling that in many areas we've slipped behind, that massive socioeconomic gaps haven't been closed, that stuff doesn't quite work as well as it used to, be it a train track on a hot day, a potholed road, or a hospital building that's well past its use-by date. We've grown quite quickly and our investment hasn't met demand. We haven't replaced or renewed our networked assets at a rate that will sustain our environment and sometimes even our public health. And finally, we just haven't nailed that major requirement around actually delivering major projects and doing that well. One survey, and this is worldwide, of 3,000 infrastructure projects found that only 27% were delivered on budget, 3% on budget and time, and only 0.2% on budget, on time, and of the quality expected. So New Zealand isn't alone in that challenge. We've just heard, we've got an infrastructure deficit of about estimated $200 billion. We need to invest, according to the Infrastructure Commission, $30 billion a year, every year, for the next 30 years to renew what we've got and build what we need. And my sense is we know what we need to do, but that we must understand why we've got so bad at just getting stuff built. There's also that more compelling question to pose first, and we heard that as well just before. Where are we going and why? What are the compelling aspects of our nationhood that should be enhanced? We lack a bit of a national vision for this country. And infrastructure is a major means to get where we need to go, and it will take us there if it's done right in the right timeframes. It can help deliver a fulfilling and healthy life by building a more productive and sustainable country. Economist Paul Krugman famously said, "Productivity isn't everything, but it almost is." And I'd like to paraphrase that by saying, in a New Zealand context, infrastructure isn't everything, but it almost is. Social polarisation and a 24-hour news cycle has forced reactive immediacy from our leaders. The opportunity for clear thought and long-term aspiration, which then should be followed by well-formulated, evidence-based detailed policy, now appears to elude us much of the time. And I understand Helen Clark said last night that we govern in 3-year terms, not for the long term. We must change that. Think slow, act fast. I've been reminded of this over the last week as the Infrastructure New Zealand team has evaluated the great work of the public and private sectors on fast-tracking a bridge and road restoration not too far from here. There was space to think and plan properly at the start, and once that was done, the project could move at lightning speed, so it was early and at budget. And unfortunately, it appears, I think, to most New Zealanders that this is by far and away the exception when we build infrastructure. We can do it on a relatively small project where urgency is required, but we need to make it the new New Zealand way of doing things. That takes a change of mindset. And so the challenge for this government and its successors will be to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, build those important projects that you've promised, we need them. But your legacy should be also about setting that unified direction about what the future looks like that we can buy into, and also be coupled with delivery reality. The structural changes needed in the system requiring an upscaled and upskilled public service and partnership with an enhanced private infrastructure sector to be able to work together to ensure and build to an ongoing pipeline of properly assessed projects that build our economic and social prosperity. Kia ora.
Thank you, Greg.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Great to be with you here today in the Waikato. Thank you to the Waikato Business School. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about Transpower. For those of you who don't know, you own us, so I'll tell you a bit about what you own. We are a state-owned enterprise. We're the owner and operator of a critical piece of infrastructure, the national electricity grid. And the grid's built a bit like the motorway. We own the main motorway that spans from Bluff in the south, Kaikoui in the north, and we take power from the electricity generators and move it to the distribution companies, like Well Networks here in the Waikato, that then distributes to homes and businesses. We have around $5 billion of assets, 174 substations, 25,000 transmission towers, more than 11,000 kilometres of lines, and the HVDC high voltage direct current network that links the North and South Island. We have another really critical role, 2 roles. The second role is as the system operator. So we run the electricity market in real time, 24/7, 365, matching supply and demand and maintaining power quality. So at any time you can turn the lights on with confidence and know that you can increase your demand and it will be quietly met behind the light switch. To give you confidence, the electricity infrastructure is in pretty good health, particularly compared to other infrastructure. So we have our assets in a good state and they're providing a good quality service. But the national grid is coming to the end of its life in a large part of our network because it was built in the 50s and 60s. Done a lot of work to build, refurbish, maintain, but at the end of the extending your asset life, you need to replace it. So we have quite a big capital program to replace our assets over the next 10 to 15 years. And we've planned for that in our next regulatory control period. We are regulated by the Commerce Commission under price quality regulation. We put forward every 5 years an application for funding for capital and for operating costs for a 5-year period, and they assess us versus quality standards, meeting metrics, and say, yes, you can recover this amount of money from customers to deliver that service. So we've applied for a 32% increase in capital for that period 25 to 2030 to make sure we maintain the grid in good health. So we make sure that the system is in good health, but that won't unclog the arteries. New Zealand's government's made a range of climate commitments, and we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to decarbonise our economy, and that will be largely through electrification. And why? Because we are so well endowed as a country with a highly renewable power system. We're running at over 90% renewable power. But our overall economy is only about 30 to 40% renewable on an energy basis. So we have a fantastic opportunity to take carbon out of our hydrocarbons, out of our vehicle fleet, and the hydrocarbons out of process heat. The cost to do that won't be insignificant, but the cost if we don't do it will be significant, not just to the climate, but also to the opportunities we have ahead of us to New Zealand. I talked about how our highly renewable system is there, and we've got a lot of inquiries and people who want to build new renewables. We also have great resources for new wind and new solar, but we also need now to work out how we take the carbon, as I say, out of the demand side. That's transport process heat. We've estimated we're going to need about 22 gigawatts of new generation connected to the grid by 2050. And just to put that in context, you say, what's a gigawatt? Well, current installed capacity is 10. So it's more than doubling our capacity that's installed out to 2050. What we need to do as Transpower is a few things. We need to make sure we can connect everybody up who wants to connect to the grid, so connections to the motorway, both load and new generation. Then we have to make sure that our main system is unblocked so people can move their electrons around freely. And that in itself is quite a challenge to plan those constraints and when we need to move them. We have a $400 million capital approval that's just been tentatively approved by the Commerce Commission for $400 million that will unblock the remaining capacity in that main grid backbone. The next step's going to be building new lines, and we're going to need a larger grid backbone with more interconnections. And also the local lines companies are going to have to make a significant investment to unblock their networks and their systems for all this new distributed generation and more demand that is going to come into the system. Electrification is going to bring great challenges and also opportunities. First of all, in terms of managing the transition, we have to try and get you excited about the opportunity. Electrification, most people's eyes glaze when we talk about it, but actually it is a wonderful opportunity for us to decarbonise. But in terms of managing the transition, we have to think about fairness and equity. It's all very well if we can all afford an electric vehicle, but if you can't, how do we help people make that transition? How do we make sure that electricity stays affordable and the way we cost that and charge back from consumers is fair and equitable? We've got some challenges around our social licence. To use a glib phrase, there's no transition without transmission. How many of you are very excited about hosting a high voltage, large transmission tower in your backyard with conductors running over the top? Probably won't be in your backyard, but we need to recognise we're going to need more land for solar, more land for wind, and more land for transmission lines in order to take carbon out of our economy. To decarbonise, we're going to need to do that, but we need to get that social licence to get New Zealanders willing to do that. Other countries talk about bananas. Build absolutely no assets anywhere near anybody. That's quite challenging when you're running and planning a power system. Further challenges are around workforce. With that massive build, we estimate that for our service providers who do all the work in our field, maintaining, break fixing and building, we're going to need to double our workforce. And these are highly skilled people, apprentices, line mechanics, substation maintainers. And at Transpower, we're going to need to add at least 200 to 300 more professional engineers to do this work. They're not just sitting around waiting for us to employ them, and the world is decarbonising. So the demand for these people and these skills is enormous. Heard a lot of conversation, I've only been here this morning unfortunately, but a lot about New Zealand. We are not an isolated economy. We are losing people to Australia. I worry about our competitiveness for our young people. How do we make sure we have those jobs in that environment that our brightest and young want to live and work and contribute here? One final thing, small technical challenge. As we are building this new exciting future, it's going to be a hell of a challenge as a system operator balancing the system as we add a whole lot more renewable intermittent generation. How are we going to firm that up? How are we going to make sure when you turn the light switch on, without base load thermal or peaking thermal plant behind, we can be sure we can keep those lights on. So lots of challenges, lots of opportunities. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks, Matt, University, for the opportunity to speak and share a few thoughts this morning. I think the title and the subject is something that's dear to my heart. Infrastructure is something I'm really passionate about. And when we think about the title of this session, Unclogging the Arteries, it does seem to me like our infrastructure networks have been, smoking a couple of packs a day since the 70s, and, we're in more need of probably a double or a triple bypass rather than the odd stent to get things moving, because we just haven't invested, and that is creating real critical issues for us, and there's a bow wave of challenge, that we're going to need to meet. So I lead an organisation, Tainui Group Holdings. We've been trying to make some material changes and investments in infrastructure. The biggest one being the Ruakura Super Hub, which is just sort of over here. And that's really looking to unblock some of the supply chain challenges and how we connect New Zealand to the rest of the world and move freight, not only within our country, but connecting to the rest of the world, and doing it in a way that is more climate friendly than just chucking everything in trucks and moving around. And one of the stats that I like to use around freight is when you look at a truck carrying a container on the road, 40% of those have got nothing in them. We are just hugely inefficient. So Ruakura, it's 490 hectares, and we're developing that over time. And really this morning just wanted to share a few lessons and key points from our 17-year overnight success at Ruakura, and the challenges of bringing something like that to bear. And following on from Nick, one of the things that I think that is sadly lacking in New Zealand is vision and confidence around infrastructure, and I'll touch on a few of those thoughts as well. So from a TGH point of view, when we come up with the bold idea to have an inland port and logistics hub here in Hamilton, some people thought we were crazy. And we had no idea that it would take 17 years to get to the start line. Through multiple, challenges, through planning courts, dealing with councils, dealing with residents. 17 years to get to the start line for something that, when you look at it now, is just really obvious. And one of the things that has enabled it to be delivered is that strength of the vision. We always knew it was the right thing to do, the right location, and was something that was not only important for us, for our owners, Waikato Tainui, but also important for the region and important for the country as a whole. So that strength of vision, enables you to carry something like this through. And Ruakura certainly wasn't a case of build it and they will come. One of the challenges, from an economic point of view and growing productivity is you've got this gap between, getting something to the start line and getting something that people can see and touch to get people to commit and to make those changes. And, we're very lucky in terms of our development, that we've got great partners, not only with the regional authorities, but also with our tenants in Kmart, Maersk, Peter Baker Transport, Big Chill, and Port of Tauranga, and others to come. So it's that catch-22, you have the opportunity, but that initial hump to get to the start line is horrific. So using Ruakura as an example, just to put the roads and a bit of water and so on in, it's well over $100 million. And you have to front load and spend that money just to get to the start line. And that challenge is huge, and unless you have that force of character, obviously you have a big balance sheet, very few people and businesses can actually take that challenge on. But when you get there, then everyone celebrates that success. So the way that we overcame, those challenges is through the PGF and the shovel-ready process. We had some seed money from the government to fund the roading network, and that was the bit that just enabled us to really get going. It wasn't huge, but was vitally important for us to get going. And what that meant was, we had the bulldozers and the trucks ready to go. So once, we had that commitment and that confidence, we could keep going. And if you think about Waikato, one of the critical things, that happens is, we built that based on the expressway and the intersection of, the East Coast Main Trunk Line and the Waikato Expressway. So once, you start signalling big infrastructure, industry, business will get behind and they will invest and they will make decisions. That means that not only does that create, prosperity, it creates opportunity, but it also takes some of the pain away from, the government in terms of delivering some of these things. So for me, it's not all about what we're trying to get away from, which is broken pipes, broken roads, potholes, and a massive infrastructure deficit. We need to have the ability to clearly articulate what's needed, where we're going, and what does our future look like. Another question and thing that we see a lot is that when we look to deliver infrastructure, we're seeking perfection. And when we seek perfection, we end up with procrastination. And when we look to deliver infrastructure in New Zealand, what quite often happens is we're trying to solve a whole bunch of disparate needs. And what that means is that projects that should be relatively simple become bigger than Ben Hur, and then the costs blow out, and then we go, oh, this is too hard, and the can just gets pushed down the road for future generations. So getting infrastructure done requires a real force of character, and it requires leadership. We need to be able to articulate what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, and when we're going to do it. And if we can articulate that vision, people will get behind it. I mean, in the previous session, the question was raised around tax cuts. If we can articulate to the taxpayer, hey, we're not going to give you tax cuts, but we're going to give you this infrastructure that's going to make your life better, most people will get behind that and accept that and willing to make those investments that are going to make their lives better on a day-to-day basis. And I think from a government point of view, we've got a bunch of, bodies that are trying to provide that leadership, but it must come from government. And they have to put a stake in the ground around some of the big decisions. An obvious one that's pretty close to us is future ports. We've had, I don't know how many future port studies, but everyone knows the port has to go into the Firth of Thames. So why don't we just say that? Why don't we say this is where it's going to go, and it's going to happen in our lifetimes, and actually just get on with it. So looking ahead, we need to make the right decisions around the types of infrastructure that we invest in, and we need to be clear around what we're trying to achieve. And as I said earlier, we can't solve all things for all people with one project. We need to be clear about what we're trying to achieve and go for it. One of the things that I think is quite interesting and probably the point that I'll leave you this morning is technology is changing, and that is going to have a significant impact on infrastructure. So you look at the rise of AI, augmented reality, and virtual reality, that is going to completely change the way that we live and work, and that is coming very, very quickly. And that means that we're going to need a whole lot more infrastructure in order to be able to take advantage of that, And if we don't, we're going to be left behind. And that's going to be critical. So if you look at, for example, Melbourne and Sydney, I think Melbourne's got 7 data centres that have been built and another 2 under construction. Sydney's similar. How many have we got in New Zealand? Those are cities that are, approximate to the economy of New Zealand. We need to be doing more of this and planning it, and actually getting ahead. Because AI is just going to transform the way that we live and work, and it's going to require a significant amount of infrastructure. And the last thing that we want to be doing is relying on capacity and infrastructure that's in the US or Singapore or on the eastern seaboard of Australia. And that exposes us to geopolitical risks and a whole bunch of other things that we don't necessarily want to be exposed to. And obviously, data centres, one of the critical things with that is electricity. And, you think about, the 22, I think it was gigawatts of electricity that we need. We have the tools to be able to create climate-friendly energy. We have a wonderful natural endowment, that means that we could be 100% renewable energy. But do we actually have the willpower to do the things that we need to do, whether it be another hydro scheme or things that we could easily do, but probably won't. And that's where the vision is really important for our country, that we start making the steps forwards that are going to enable us to live a bright and prosperous future. Because if we don't, where we're going is our standard of living is rapidly declining. And, the generation below me, many of them are not going to call New Zealand their home unless we make the investments that we need to make now. And that's a critical thing that we need to do, because if we don't, as our standard of living declines, our children will go out to the rest of the world to find those higher standards of living. So we need vision, and we need to make that vision a reality and make the investments and have the force of character to do the things that may not be popular but are necessary. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There were clear links with the previous panel and with panels over the last few days, and of course with the next panel, particularly your comments, Alison, on the emissions and so forth, which will be picked up in our next panel. Lots and lots of questions coming through. Where I'd like to start, though, is with this issue of how do we balance spending on new infrastructure with spending on maintenance of existing infrastructure? And a side question, could the panel comment on wasteful spending on infrastructure in New Zealand? Would you like to start on this one, Nick?
Yes, I think it's really important that we define what our deficit looks like in terms of, quite quickly, in terms of what we need to spend on renewals, what hasn't been spent on renewals and what needs to be invested. There is an opportunity, I think, to group some of that work together into sort of larger projects to make those infrastructure projects worthwhile completing, nationally and internationally in themselves. But for three water infrastructure, we're thinking, there are some various figures, but it's between $80 and $180 billion. That is massive, whichever end that is. For roading, it's clearly in the billions, and for rail also. If we look at the impact on both the Wellington and Auckland passenger rail networks because of poor renewals over a long period of time, those are really significant. So I think it is quite important to assess it, focus on quite a fast move renewal, and then think about those major projects that New Zealand still needs. So that's...
Yeah. And of course, water and many of these other areas of infrastructure are things that you know quite a lot about.
I do.
But these billions that you're talking about, that's for the rebuild. But to what extent? How do we
You can't build a new extension on your house if your foundations are going to fall over. That's just nutty. So we have to grip up and look at our infrastructure deficit for poorly maintained assets in the past. And I think accept the fact that asset management is a discipline. It requires professional people who are really skilled. It might be really, really boring, but you do asset health, condition assessment, risk, criticality. These take very sophisticated skills. We've spent years building a foundation to really understand our assets, criticality, risk, condition, and intervene appropriately, because if you do good life extension, you can manage and get better cost trade-offs. But this is boring stuff, but it's so essential.
Yes.
So don't go and build your skyscraper on a foundation that's going to fall over, because that's going to be stupid. We have to work out what the deficit is, and I'm pleased to say in electricity, just grace of God, we've been well funded. It's in reasonable health, notwithstanding we have to refurbish. But look at our roads. We've not been investing enough in maintaining. We've been building shiny new stuff. If you don't invest in what's there, the cost to catch it later is so much more than the cost of maintaining it well as you go. So yes, we all want shiny new things, but we have to bite the reality and fix and maintain and fund for the long term what we've got if you want to maintain it, or else turn it off. But I just think all this new money going into shiny things before you're investing, yes, you have to do it well, yes, you have to make sure you've got, but it also requires capability, balance sheets, scale, competency, IT systems. This is not going to come from doing it in a really fragmented way. This is about big infrastructure. We need capable, big skills, big balance sheets to maintain this.
And it's certainly not boring when it goes wrong, isn't it? We've all experienced that. We'll go back to Nick and then we'll go to Chris.
It is just a question, really. I mean, those things are all, I completely agree. But Alison, the one ingredient that I think is missing that I'd like you to comment on, you work in a very regulated sector. I'd like you to just talk to the impact of good regulation on your ability to do all those things and to really be focused on investing in those systems as well as the actual asset renewal.
Yeah, I laugh because being regulated is a pain as well as a blessing. We are regulated by the Commerce Commission, as I say, for how big our pie is in a 5-year period, and then the Electricity Authority decides what portion of this delicious pie you all get to eat, and you're all on diets. So there's two different debates we have. But Nick, to answer your question, it is, in the long term it helps us because we have funding certainty. We have to satisfy the Commerce Commission as our regulator that we prudently need to spend that amount of money. And we go through a rigorous period of about a 9-month assessment with an independent verifier, which is an engineering and economics consultant that comes in and pores over our books. We make regulatory applications about this high. Won't be paper these days, but it's a very, very detailed process where they can assure you that we are following good engineering industry practice. The amount of money we need to spend, we will continue to deliver a quality service at these quality measures, these asset health measures. So it is, if people who love economics, economic pricing theory is very exciting and very detailed, trying to approximate markets, but it does work for us. And I think things like long-lived assets, like us, like a lot of countries around the world have the same kind of regulation for water, very similar assets, because it's having that ability to fund in the long term to do the maintenance and to be able to maintain the assets. So yes, although regulation can be painful, it works. And it is a good check and balance.
Yes.
Thanks. Chris, did you want to add?
Yeah, for me, just going back to the first question, we have to have a clear roadmap of what's needed and how we're going to do it. And it is that balancing between, new infrastructure and fixing what we've got, but also there's no point putting money into old assets if they're not going to take you to where you need to be. I think, in terms of regulation, I think for some of our infrastructure assets, particularly water, I think, we could be much better served. And also, I think the way that we own infrastructure and the fact that it's disaggregated, does us a massive disservice. And one of the critical things that we're going to need in order to solve the infrastructure deficit is a lot of capital. And that capital clearly can't come from the taxpayer alone, and that means that we're going to need to bring in private investment at scale in order to basically get to where we need to be.
Can I build on what Chris has just said? I think the other thing I'd really advocate for this holistic view of infrastructure, if there's one thing Cyclone Gabrielle really taught us, it's the criticality of all infrastructure services coming together. I'm sure you'll all recall we had a substation underwater, but what was critical for us in restoring services to the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne area was water, roading, telco, power. It all had to come together. So I think as a country we also have to start to do some of this long-term planning and make trade-offs. How much of our transportation do we want via rail, via road, via shipping? So you can't think about ports in isolation from our Kiwi Rail discussions, from our Whakakotahi NZTA discussions. We need to think about infrastructure in its totality and work out also what we need, but also what can we afford and how are we going to pay for it.
Yeah, you take that port piece, you move the...
16 port studies, I think, by the way.
There'll probably be a few more before anything gets done as well. But you look at the port situation, you move the port out of downtown Auckland, that is going to have a massive impact on what we need to spend on roading, freeing up, downtown Auckland, the southern motorway, etc. So decisions that we make like that can have profound impacts on other parts of our infrastructure network. And I think you're right, Alison, you have to look at it in totality, and the decisions that we can make in one place can actually have a profound impact elsewhere. And unless you're looking at that whole of network, again, we'll make mistakes.
I'm going to change us into a slightly different tack here, but very much related. We've got some of our school students who are joining this, and they've asked a specific question. They've been paying careful attention to the demography session that we had yesterday, and they're asking, how is New Zealand planning its infrastructure to cope with the changing demographics that we are going to see in coming decades? So how is New Zealand planning to adapt its infrastructure to deal with these demographic changes? Would you like to start, or?
In terms of how we build it, or
How are we doing it? I guess the students would like some reassurance. Are we thinking about these demographic changes? Do we have the systems and so on in place that are going to deal with the world that they're going to inherit?
I think it's quite an exposing question, and I think Chris was beginning to touch on it around our place in the world. What does New Zealand offer the world, and what does the world offer New Zealand? But what are the digital connections, and are we thinking ahead? And it's difficult to predict, but things are moving so quickly. If you think about artificial intelligence, the way we produce, the way we build infrastructure, the kind of skills that we need are different. And I think that's part of that vision thing, as well as we haven't scoped that well enough. We're thinking about building back base assets, which are really, and renewing, but which is really important, but in terms of anticipating that future, and if you think about the need for carbon neutrality, we're sort of beginning to get a handle on that, but the needs of a population and a workforce in 30 to 50 years are much harder to consider, and that has to be part of the consideration and the leadership that's needed to develop a vision.
I think it's a great question, and unfortunately wasn't here yesterday, but I have had the benefit of hearing Paul Spoonley before, and it's quite confronting and scary thinking about what future demographics may mean to our country. So we think a lot about that. We think a lot about new technology. We think a lot about, will people still need our assets in the future? We build things that should last for 50, 60 years, and if you refurbish them forever, so you've got to make sure you put them in the right place at the right size and all those good things, which are kind of hard to estimate. Looking out, if I can perhaps maybe get it wrong from yesterday, but what I heard, because we had Paul Spoonley come to talk to our leadership team around what might that mean for a grid of the future, a power system of the future. We do know that we're going to have a lot more distributed generation. People are still going to want to use electricity. We're going to need to decarbonise. It's going to be the fuel of the future. We're going to have much bigger population further in the north, more in Auckland, different types around the country. We're still going to have big hydro stations that are fantastic, built a long time, deep in the south. Probably still going to need that move to lots of big power going still down that main motorway to where the load is. Big challenges with how you run a power system with generation far away from load. More distributed stuff. So yes, we do, just to give some confidence, we do think a lot about that and thinking about what might people want to do with electricity in the future and how might we best serve that, whether it's from distribution, whether it's from whatever. But it's a really good challenge.
And I'm going to take this into technology, which of course, Chris, you were talking about in your intro remarks as well. Technology may change the things that we need. When I was in San Francisco earlier in the year, I went in my first completely self-drive taxi. It's quite disconcerting when that wheel turns itself around the corner. I also was at West Lafayette, which is not what you think of as the centre of technology in the US, and there was a robot delivering pizzas along Purdue University streets. So I guess we've got changes in technology that are going to change perhaps the sort of infrastructure that we need to support our lives. But we've also got this issue that technology is changing and giving us different options. Now, some of the ways in which both of those are going to play out, we don't know about. So it's really difficult to foresee the future. But I wonder if the three of you would care to speak to either one or both of those issues about how technology is changing what we need from our infrastructure and how it's changing, or is likely to change, the way in which we supply.
Yeah, I think just going back to the previous question, I think technology is going to be a much bigger driver that we need to be thinking about than demographics, albeit in this region, Hamilton's going to be a city of 500,000 people before long, and we need to be planning for that. But from a technology point of view, how I'd liken it is AI is going to be the equivalent to the way that we live and work, to the first computers or the mobile phone. That is the scale of the change that is coming, and as we know, the pace of change when these big disruptive events happen are quicker and quicker. So I think firstly we need to have that digital technology and the infrastructure. It means the way that we build, design homes is going to be different. I think it's definitely going to have an impact on roading. As you say, in the US already, that last mile delivery is increasingly being done by robots, that are rolling along the footpath. So that's just where it's coming. And I think as a country, we need to actually get out and look at the rest of the world, because what's happening in America is things that we think is probably dreamland is reality there. And those things are just slowly starting to come to Australia, sort of 5 years behind. And then we're going to be 5 to 10 years behind them. We actually have to make the investment to know what's coming so that we can make the right decisions. And within our business, that's something that we have made a real effort to do, to go out to the rest of the world to understand, what is coming so that we can make really good decisions.
Yeah, and they're not going to be perfect because we can't forecast the future, but at least having that awareness and those insights. Nick, did you want to make any comments?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, infrastructure is the basis for all these things, and I think that is it's that bedrock. If you think about what is coming in terms of that digital revolution, connectivity for all people in this country, digital connectivity and energy connectivity as well, but for children like my kids today, ensuring an equal access to learning and technology, because jobs that exist today, whole swathes of our economy, are not going to be there in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And so the only way to arm ourselves, in lieu of being able to predict exactly what's needed and where, is awareness and education and skills that will be able to take advantage of those digital enhancements. So infrastructure, the principle of infrastructure is the bedrock will remain. We've just got to, yes, we've got to educate and we've got to innovate in terms of what we get from our infrastructure. And it is this thing about all things being connected. We've got to plan and get greater value and greater efficiency out of what we build, and that's our national challenge.
And it's interesting that when you were making those comments, I was thinking back to our session on agriculture yesterday, in which we were talking also about this intersection between technology and making sure we've not just got the technology, but we've got the skills to be able to use it. Alison, any comments on technology?
Yeah, I just think
in your
that
sector?
technology and AI has such a huge driver of productivity and opportunity for productivity. We're using it a lot now. People talk about it as if it suddenly happened. Machine learning's been around since the sort of 80s or before. And if you think about the market system that runs the electricity market in real time, it's run off algorithms all the time doing stuff. So there's a lot of algorithms, AI, stuff happening. And it's critical when you're running big infrastructure because it helps you predict, be more efficient, and it's much smarter the way you run things. But again, coming back to my analogy about foundations on the house, AI can only work and help you if you have really good data. You understand what problems you're trying to solve, what's the end case, what data do I need to solve that problem, how do I best measure it, how do I make sure the data I'm collecting is accurate, quality data, then I can analyze it. It's a bit like repiling your house again. You've got to have that good data stuff, and again, I think that's where, as infrastructure, we need to make sure we have those foundations in place before we can do all the smart stuff. It's a really exciting future out there in this whole area, but it does require some pretty boring getting the basics in shape and investment in that.
And that's been a comment you've made a few times, and of course your comments on AI are very close to those of us working in educational institutions where we're grappling with this issue of how do we encourage students to use these technologies, but use them sensibly and not use the technology to rely on for the answers, but use the technology to help you shape your information. I'm going to turn to, we've just got a minute and a half left, so if we can do a sort of 30-second wrap of our topic is this briefing to the incoming government. We've had a lot of conversation about looking into what's needed for infrastructure as a very far into the future we need to look. But how about for the next 3 to 5 years? Let's talk about that. What would you like to see if we invite you back on this panel in say 3 years' time? What would you most like to have seen happen? Nick?
Develop the vision, build the system, and focus on delivery. That the next government after this one can pick up and deliver their program on. We too much chopping and changing, too much start-stop. Actually, it is about just those fundamentals of knowing what you want to do, having the system, public and private, to deliver, and then actually do the mahi and get it done.
Yeah, for me, very similar. We need to articulate the vision around infrastructure, what we need, where we're going, and why, and have that general understanding and support by the population base. And we just got to do things. The government needs to signal that things are going to happen, and making those signals now, even if things are not built in the next 3 years, that gives confidence, and it enables things to get started and get moving. And wider business, NGOs and others will start to make investment decisions based on what is coming. So signal early the decisions, make some hard calls, and let's get on with it.
And very similar, get a plan. We know, let's lean into this really ugly challenge, which is how big is this infrastructure deficit, both in terms of maintenance and what we want to do. Size it. Take a deep breath and go, okay, what can we afford to do, both in terms of available resources and funding, and then have a long-term plan and commit to it. Think about all the infrastructure that has to come up together. It's no point having perfect roads if you haven't got the rest working. And then get on and make the plan happen. Stop this chopping and changing. The amount of money we invest or we spend, and then we lurch to something else and we waste it. So let's get a long-term plan, let's commit to it, and let's accept that we have to have good institutions with the right capabilities, competencies, balance sheets to make these investments so that we can be confident that the public money we're spending is going to be value for money. for the services that we all deserve and need. I want to have quality drinking water, and I don't want to put poo on my beaches. Thank you.
Well, we've had some very wise advice for this incoming government, both short term, what to achieve in their next 3 years, but also looking far into the future. So thank you very much to our panellists. Please don't go for your break yet, though, because Matt is coming up. But thank you very much for the panellists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Kia ora, and pardon me. Thanks to our panellists. All right, we are in the home stretch. We are about to take our last break of the forum before we go into our last two panel sessions. I'll talk about those in a moment. A couple of other things first. There are some people in the room who are going to an NZ PEC trade-focused lunch after this. For those that are doing that with Alan Bollard, that will be in the room across to there once we've finished the forum. That's a subset of the room. Then a couple of other people that I wanted to acknowledge. I can see in the room Member of Parliament Ryan Hamilton. Welcome, thank you. Tama Pōtaka, kia ora, in a head-to-head battle with David Hallett for the best shirts in the Waikato. Hard to tell who's winning this morning. And also acknowledge, I missed last night, Todd McClay attended our dinner. He was here, of course, he's Minister of Trade and of Agriculture, and while he didn't see the sessions on those subjects yesterday, I did check last night, there is an 8-hour video. It's not yet been sliced into the component sessions, so he's got a big weekend of watching ahead of him. And also Mayor Paula Southgate, welcome. Thank you for being here as well. So we move into a short break now. Our next session's very much focused on the future. Two critical topics. First, climate and weather, what happens if we can't curb emissions. Very much looking forward to that. And then finish on fintech, critical sector, and how we grow that for New Zealand. So have a break. If we can be back here seated at 11:05, we'll get into it. Thank you.